And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And I appreciate you being with me here on this Friday morning. We are continuing our examination of the subject why N.T. Wright is wrong on the redemption of creation and, quote, the redemption of the body. Now, as a reminder, N.T. Wright believes, along with a host of other scholars, that we are waiting for the time, the end of time, in which Christ will come out of heaven. He will come back to earth. He will recreate, renovate, restore the physical earth to its pre-sin Edenic condition. N.T. Wright eschews the idea, for instance, of dying and going to heaven. He says that's not the Christian hope. He says the Christian hope is to live on earth with Christ after the return. But in the meantime, and this is one of those great ironies, okay? In the meantime, when a Christian dies, what happens? Well, they go to heaven to be with Christ. But evidently, going to heaven and being with Christ is kind of a second class reward for faithfulness. Because again, at the end of time, Christ comes out of heaven with all of the righteous, all of the faithful who have ever lived. He takes them out of heaven and brings them back to earth to live on the earth. So this is more than a remarkable doctrine insofar as I can determine. I mean, it's the idea that going to heaven to be with Christ is somehow not the thing to be desired. To me, is really quite staggering. And yet that view is growing in some evangelical circles. So what I've been doing, I've been sharing with you what the Bible has to say based upon Romans chapter 8, 18 and following, where Paul says, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed in us. And he talks about the creation. And he said the creation itself was subjected to futility, not willingly, but in hope of the one who subjected it. And so we are told, and again, this is N.T. Wright's view, that the creation there is non-sentient, physical, material creation, as well as what I fondly like to say, bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes. And so the question has become, or the question is, when the Bible predicts the new creation, when it predicts the new heaven and the new earth, is it talking about a renewed material physical creation? We have examined Isaiah 64 and 65 at great length. Well, I say at great length. We've examined it a little bit. We left a whole bunch of stuff out. But one of the things that we focused on was demonstrating that both Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66, both unequivocally posit the new creation at the time of the judgment and destruction of Old Covenant Israel. I mean, Isaiah 64 and 65 are too clear on this. And furthermore, over the last 2 weeks, I've shared with you not only the definition of creation, that it is not the material creation, and it is not bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes, but the creation that was longing, the creation that was in futility, was mankind. Now, I shared with you that the book of Ecclesiastes, 13 chapters, uses the word in the Septuagint, uses the Greek word mataiotes, which is translated as futility or vanity in most translations, to speak of Solomon and how his wealth, his power, his influence allowed him to experience every single human, quote, pleasure that could possibly be imagined. And yet, in spite of that, Solomon said, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 9 and following, I came to hate life because indulging in material pleasure, indulging in power, influence, power broking is a modern term that we might use. He realized that was not bringing him satisfaction. And mataiotes is never used in the Bible to speak of bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes not being what they were originally intended to be, not reaching their potential as bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes. The word futility is used of man living a life in rebellion against God. So, what I want to do now, and we went back to Romans chapter 8 last week, and I was actually getting ahead of myself, I must confess, because there are two more Old Testament prophecies of the redemption of creation that I really, really have to discuss. The very first of those is Isaiah chapter 49. Now, Isaiah 49 is absolutely incredible. Okay, look, as so many chapters in Isaiah are, the chapters are just loaded down with meaning, with words, terms, phrases, motifs, and themes that when one views those chapters through the prism of Jesus Christ and what the New Testament writers have to say as they talk about Christ, and this is what's critical, and they apply those Old Testament prophecies to him, I mean, it's stunning. I heard one preacher say, well, I've heard several preachers say this, when the New Testament writers quote an Old Testament prophecy of the kingdom, the Messiah, the judgment, the resurrection, etc., etc., and the New Testament writers, apostles, quote those very Old Testament prophecies and apply them temporally to the first century, and they apply those prophecies spiritually to the work of Christ, then really honestly, we have to have help from somebody, from somewhere, to misunderstand those applications. I mean, it's literally stunning at times at the argumentum ad desperatum, arguments from desperation, that some people make in order to counter, in order to offset, in order to deny the New Testament applications of Old Testament prophecies. And that is precisely what happens when we go to Isaiah chapter 49. Now, I'm not going to take the time to read the entire chapter. I am going to begin reading with Isaiah 49, verse 5. And now the Lord says, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, so that Israel is gathered to him. Now, the word gathered there is from synagogue, and it's in the infinitive form, whatever. It was God's purpose to gather Israel back to him. Now, obviously, that question is raised. To gather them how? Is that geographically? Well, dispensationalists have told us that beginning in 1948, we're seeing Israel literally, visibly, physically regathered to the land. Is that what this is talking about? Well, you know what? Jesus said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent unto thee, how often I would have gathered you together." Well, here he uses an intensive form, epi-synagogue, an intensely eschatological word, to speak of the eschatological gathering, to speak of the gathering of Israel. So keep this in mind. God said, "It is my purpose to gather Israel, to gather Jacob." Now, watch this. Verse 6. "Indeed, he," that's Yahweh, "says, it is too small of a thing that you should be my servant." That's speaking of Messiah. "That you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob." Now look, when the Bible talks about the restoration of Israel, when it talks about the restoration of the tribes of Israel, it's talking about all 12 tribes. Tribes of Israel is not used in a exclusive way, but rather a comprehensive way. It's not used in a limited way. Tribes of Israel refers to the 12 tribes. So Yahweh says he was going to raise up the Messiah, and he said, "It's too small of a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Israel." In other words, to restore the 12 tribes. And to restore the preserved ones of Israel. Now watch this. "I will also, which means in addition to the gathering of the tribes of Israel, in addition to restoring the tribes of Israel, I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth." So God said, when he would send Messiah, Messiah's mission, the end goal, would be to restore Israel. Now look, we're often told, well, Jesus said he was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. See, it's Israel only. Well, that's nonsense. Absolute nonsense. He was sent to Israel first. He was sent to fulfill the mission to and for Israel. But, and I don't have time to go into this morning, over and over and over, I mean repeatedly, especially in the book of Isaiah, we find the promise of the redemption of Zion. Well, guess what? The restoration of Zion is always, listen to me, catch the power of this. The restoration of Zion is always inclusive of all 12 tribes, just like Isaiah 49. Restoration of Israel and the restoration of the tribes of Israel is inclusive of all 12 tribes. So now God says, in addition to redeeming Israel, the tribes of Israel, I will also make you a light to the Gentiles. Now watch. As I mentioned a moment ago, throughout the Tanakh, you have the promise of the restoration of Zion. Well, you see, the restoration of Zion is always couched within the context of the restoration of all 12 tribes. But here's the kicker to this. This is the power of this. In addition to, just like Isaiah 49 says, I will also make you a light to the Gentiles. In those passages promising the redemption of Zion, i.e. the 12 tribes, the Lord said, once he restored Israel, once he restored Zion, meaning the 12 tribes, he would call the Gentiles to his glory that they, along with Israel, might glorify him. So this prophecy of Isaiah 49, now I'm giving all of this as a precursor to where we're going. And we're going to be talking momentarily about the restoration of the earth. But you see, the context of the promise of the restoration of the earth is the restoration of Israel. There is no dichotomy here. There is no distinction. There is no temporal gap between the restoration of Israel, the tribes of Jacob, the calling of the Gentiles, and the restoration of the land, or the restoration of the earth. Now watch this. Okay, I got to hurry here. Okay, verse 7, thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel, their Holy One, to the one whom man despises, to him whom the nation abhors, to the servant of rulers, kings shall see and rise. Princes also shall worship because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, and he has chosen you. Who was it that was hated, despised? Well, chapter 53, it's Messiah. So, got to hurry here. Verse 8. Now, watch this. Do not miss this. In an acceptable time, I have heard you. In the day of salvation, I have helped you. I will preserve you and give you as a covenant to the people. Now, remember, he's talking about Messiah here, the one who is hated, the one who is despised. I will preserve you. I will give you as a covenant to the people. Now watch, here's the kicker, to restore the earth, to cause them to inherit the desolate places, that you may say to the prisoner, go forth. To those who are in darkness, show yourselves. And my goodness, really need to really need to read the entire chapter. Do yourself a favor and do that. Now watch this. Messiah would restore the tribes of Israel. He would also call the Gentiles. When he would be given as a covenant to the people, he would restore the earth. Now, if this is not the new heaven and new earth, what is it? If this is not the redemption of creation, what is it? I can already hear someone saying, well, now, Don, you have to understand that the word earth there is ha'aretz, which is correct, and can often be used or translated as the land, which is correct. But guess what? New heaven, new earth is also ha'aretz. Not a different word, same word. So, got to hurry here. Once again, Isaiah 49, redemption of Israel, salvation of the Gentiles, being made a covenant to the people, restore the earth. Now, notice that it says, in an acceptable time, I have heard you, and in the day of salvation, I have succored you. All of this would take place, all right? Salvation of the tribes of Jacob, calling the Gentiles, the new covenant, restoration of the earth in the acceptable time, the day of salvation. Now, I know that we have an awful lot of really, really, really good Bible students that watch my videos. So I can imagine that in your mind, we have an awful lot of people that are already flipping over in their Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Now, Isaiah is about the time of reconciliation. Okay? After all, he's going to reconcile the 12 tribes of Israel, or the tribes of Israel, with each other, and then he's going to reconcile the Gentiles with Israel. Could there be any more powerful expression of reconciliation? So, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, 18 and following, Paul the apostle had this to say. Now, all of these things are of God, who has reconciled us to himself through Jesus Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, that God was in Christ reconciling the world. See, that would be Jew and Gentile. To himself, not imputing their trespasses to them, and has committed to us the ministry of reconciliation. Now then, we are ambassadors for Christ's sake, as though God were pleading through us. We implore you, be ye reconciled to God. For he, that is God, made him, that is Christ, made him to be sin for us, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. Chapter 6, verse 1. Tragic chapter division. We then, as workers together with him, also plead with you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, in an acceptable time I have heard you, and in the day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, today is the day of salvation. Now let me ask you something, ladies and gentlemen. Was Paul wrong when he said he was living in the time foretold by Isaiah, the acceptable time, the day of salvation? Was Paul wrong? Well, let's keep in mind that Paul tells us repeatedly that his eschatology, that his gospel, was nothing but the hope of Israel found in the Old Covenant prophets. So for brevity here, to close this out, Isaiah 49 foretold that in the acceptable time and in the day of salvation, Yahweh, through the Messiah, would restore the earth and reconcile Jews and Gentiles. Paul said, behold, now, that's his time, 2,000 years ago. And somebody says, well, if you're going to make that application, does that mean the day of salvation is over? No. God was working through Paul and the apostles to bring Jew and Gentile together and to create one new man, one new creation that will never pass away. But that was the distinctive time of salvation, the distinctive time of the acceptable time, to bring that to a reality. We now live in that reality of the new creation. As Gary DeMar said on his blog just this week, we're living in what the Bible calls the age to come. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? The age to come is the new creation. It's the new heaven and the new earth. Now, since Paul said that the time foretold by Isaiah was present in the first century, and since Isaiah 49 foretold the restoration of the earth in the day of salvation and in the acceptable time, was Paul going around preaching to bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes? Was Paul going around preaching to trees and saying, you know, you really need to get bigger. You need to get taller. You need to produce more fruit. You need to produce better wood. I know that's facetious. But if you're going to make the argument, ladies and gentlemen, that the Bible is predicting the restoration of material physical earth, then why was that restoration of material physical earth not happening in the first century when Paul said today is the day of salvation, and the day of salvation was to be the day of the restoration of the earth? See the issue? You see the problem? The problem of saying the redemption of creation has to do with bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes, or better, trees and shrubs and flowers and what have you. We cannot deny, we simply cannot deny that Paul placed the fulfillment of Isaiah 49 and its promise of the restoration of the earth in the first century. Thank you for joining me for this morning's morning musings. By the way, won't be with you next Monday. Guess what? Next Monday is my wife and my 53rd wedding anniversary. So guess what? We're going to celebrate. All right? So we'll be with you Monday. Be back with you on Tuesday. Thanks again for joining me. I hope that you have enjoyed this video. Be sure to pass the word. Tell others about our videos. We appreciate it. And I'll see you next week.